The last thing Sergeant Dara Voss heard before the world changed was the sound of her own breathing inside a hazmat mask, and the particular silence that follows when every animal within a kilometer has stopped making noise at once. She had been in the mountains for 6 hours. Crash site was 3 clicks uphill from a logging road that hadn't appeared on any current map, in a valley the Air Force had been pretending didn't exist since Thursday. Team of 4 had been reduced to 2 when Corporal Reyes went back to carry Huang out. Huang, whose leg had gone in ways. Legs aren't supposed to, when he'd slipped descending the ice shelf above the first debris scatter. Left Voss and Specialist Tomas Arellano, 22 years old, from Laredo, Texas, who wore a small copper medallion on a beaded cord around his neck because his grandmother had made him promise. The medallion caught the gray morning light as he crouched beside the pod. It wasn't large. Smaller than she'd expected from the orbital track data. Maybe the size of a compact car crushed to half its height. Some composite material that wasn't quite metal and wasn't quite bone, scorched amber and black along one side where it had kissed the atmosphere. There were no seams she could identify, no obvious hatch. The surface was smooth in a way that felt wrong. The way smooth feels wrong on things that have no business being smooth. Don't touch it, Voss said. Arellano looked up at her, both hands hovering an inch above the surface. Wasn't. You were about to. He pulled his hands back. The medallion swung on its cord and tapped the pod's surface. A tiny musical sound, almost a bell, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then the pod opened. It didn't hinge, it didn't slide. The material simply ceased to be a barrier in the way water ceases to be ice. A phase change, an absence where there had been substance, was inside looked, at first, like a person. It was not a person. Voss had seen the briefing photographs from Site Kappa, the ones that got 30 people quietly reassigned to posts in Greenland, after they'd looked at them too long. She had looked at them long enough to understand what she was dealing with, and then she had set them face down on the table and poured herself a coffee she didn't drink. What she understood, from those photographs and from the 15-minute encrypted call with Dr. Casas at the Biologic Division, was this. There were at a minimum 3 distinct entities recovered or observed in the last 8 days. One was dead, one was missing, one was here. The one in front of her had hair the color of new moss after rain, hanging loose around, a face that was somewhere between beautiful and wrong, in the way that a near symmetry is wrong. Not because anything was missing, but because too much was present. Its skin held a faint luminescence, the kind of glow that living things produce when they are intensely, terribly alive. It was looking at her, not past her, not at the general human-shaped threat she represented. At her. The way a person looks at a person. Arellano made a sound that wasn't a word. Stay back, Voss said quietly. The entity turned its gaze to Arellano, to the medallion. Something in its face shifted. Not an expression she had names for, but the movement of recognition. It lifted one hand, very slowly, the way you'd lift your hands to show you were unarmed, and touched 2 fingers to the place, on its own chest, where the medallion would have been. Arellano took 1 step forward. Arellano. Her voice was flat, military, the voice she used when she meant it. Stand down. He stopped, but he didn't look away from it, and it didn't look away from him, and the space between them was charged with something Voss had no protocol for. She pulled up the sat phone and called it in. The response came back in 40 seconds. Hold position, do not engage. Team inbound, ETA 40 minutes. And then, in a voice she didn't recognize, Sergeant Voss. Whatever it does, whatever it says, do not let it leave the site. She put the phone away and looked at the entity, which was still sitting in the opened pod with the morning cold pouring off the mountains around it, wearing something that looked like a garment but moved like a second skin, watching her with those 2 present eyes. I don't suppose you speak English, she said. It blinked. A slow, deliberate blink. And then it spoke, 3 syllables. In a language that sounded like someone had taken music and compressed it into breath, and Voss felt the syllables land somewhere, behind her sternum like a tuning fork. She didn't understand the words. She understood the tone. It was asking her something, specifically her. Not about the pod. Not about the tactical situation. Not about whether she was going to shoot it. Something smaller and more direct than any of those things. She looked at Arellano. He was watching her with an expression that meant he felt it too. "I don't know," she said, to the entity, to the air, to whatever part of herself the sound had vibrated. "Genuinely don't know." The team that arrived wasn't the team she'd expected. She'd expected a mobile unit from Site Kappa, hazmat, maybe a biologic cage. What came up the mountain was a 12-person extraction detail in civilian vehicles. 3 SUVs with modified suspension that sat too low to be carrying only passengers. And a man in a gray coat who introduced himself as Director Moss and didn't offer a rank or an agency. He was 60 or so, built like someone who had been large once and was now compressing. He had the eyes of a man who had spent a long time looking at things that required him to feel nothing about them. He looked at the entity and something moved across his face that wasn't nothing. He turned it back into nothing quickly. But Voss had spent her career watching people's faces for the quarter second before they decided what expression to wear, and she filed it away. "Good work, Sergeant," Moss said. "Your team will be debriefed separately." "Arlano comes with me," she said. "He's my man, he comes with me." She said it in the same voice she'd used with Arlano earlier, the voice that wasn't asking. Moss looked at her for a long moment. "Fine." They separated the entity from the pod by means that Voss wasn't shown. She and Arlano were taken to one of the SUVs and driven down the mountain while the extraction happened behind them. Through the rear window, she watched the operatives moving around the pod with the careful, contained movements of people who were afraid but had been trained to appear professional about it. "Did it say to you?" Arlano asked quietly. "I don't know, but it said something." "Yes." He turned the copper medallion over in his fingers. His grandmother had pressed it into his hand the morning he shipped out and told him, "Some things are older than danger, and they know the difference." He had thought it was the kind of thing grandmothers said. He wasn't sure anymore. "The way it looked at the medallion," he said. "I know, like it recognized it." "I know, Arlano." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the mountain fell away beneath them, and the logging road unwound through the pine. "What happens to it now?" She didn't answer, because she knew the answer, and the answer was the kind of thing that, once said aloud, becomes heavier. Site Kappa was underground. Not metaphorically, not a bunker, not a converted facility, but actually underground, cut into limestone bedrock 200 meters below a stretch of desert that appeared on satellite imagery as unremarkable scrubland. The elevator down smelled like recycled air and industrial solvent. The corridors were lit the specific shade of white that makes everything look slightly post-mortem. They held Voss and Arlano for 18 hours, separate rooms, standard debrief protocol, except that the questions were not standard. The questions were the kind that a person asks when they already have a hypothesis and are looking for confirmation. And the hypothesis frightened them enough that they needed a second opinion from someone who'd been close to the subject. The questions were about whether the entity had touched her, whether she had felt anything when it spoke, whether, in the moment the pod opened, she had experienced anything she would describe as non-voluntary. She answered honestly. She had felt the tone of its voice in her chest. She had not been compelled. She had not moved toward it or away from it, out of any instinct she couldn't name. The interviewer, a woman with a tablet who never gave her name, made a note.
"What happens to it?"
Voss asked for the second time that day. The interviewer looked up. "That's above your clearance, Sergeant." "Humor me." The interviewer set the tablet down. For a moment she looked like a person instead of a function. "There are people here who believe it should be studied." "Understood. There are people who believe it represents a resource, specifically its biology, which has certain properties that are." She stopped. "Above your clearance." "And the people who disagree with both those groups." The interviewer picked up the tablet again. Voss thought about the expression she'd seen on Moss's face. The quarter second before nothing. She found Arlano in the corridor, outside the debrief rooms, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, and the medallion turning in his fingers, which was a habit he had when he was working through something he couldn't solve. With the available information. "They want to use it," he said, when she sat down beside him. "Yes. For what?" She thought about the briefing photograph she'd set face down on a table 6 weeks ago. She thought about the word doctor Kessas had used. Hermaphroditic, And the way he'd said it with the flat affect of a man describing something he was trying not to understand the full implications of. Species is dying, she said. Or they think it is. And this particular one, is the only viable reproductive template left. Or close to it. Arellano was quiet. What we recovered from the other two crash sites was consistent with a hunt, she said. One was trying to reach it. One was trying to destroy it. We've been here 8 days, and we're the third party in a conflict we barely have the vocabulary for. And Moss wants to be the fourth party. That's my read. The medallion turned. Arellano looked at it for a moment, then looked up at the ceiling of the corridor, which was bare limestone with conduit running along it. What does it want? I don't know. You said it asked you something. The tone was a question. I can't tell you what was asked. She paused. Whatever it was asking me specifically, not as a human, as me. That was the thing she'd been turning over. The entity in the pod had looked at a great many things since it woke. The mountain, the sky, Arellano, the retrieval team, the elevator, the corridor. It had looked at all of them with those two present eyes, in a way that suggested it was cataloging, assessing, measuring distances and intentions. When it looked at her, it did something different. When it looked at her, it was asking. She had been asked things before. She had been asked to hold positions and cross lines and make determinations about acceptable losses and sign forms, that as she understood the consequences. She had been asked things by people above her and below her and beside her in the dark before operations, when nobody was supposed to be asking anything. She had never been asked the way this thing asked. With its entire attention. With nothing held back. The breach happened at 0340. She heard the alarms first. Not the wail she'd expected, but a lower frequency, a subsonic pulse that she felt in her back teeth before she consciously registered it as alarm. Then the emergency lighting, red through the gap under her door. Then the sound of something moving through the corridor that was not human movement. Too fast, too smooth. The quality of motion belonging to something that had not evolved in gravity like theirs. She was at the door before she was fully awake. 20 years of military sleep had trained her nervous system to treat the gap between unconscious and upright as close to zero. The corridor was chaos in the contained way that highly trained people produce chaos. Running, shouting, controlled, purposeful. All of it underlaid by the low-frequency alarm that set the teeth on edge. 3 operatives ran past her, toward the containment section. She pressed back against the wall and let them go. Arellano was 3 doors down. She found him standing in his doorway with his boots on and his medallion outside his shirt, looking down the corridor the way he'd looked at the mountain. Not afraid exactly, but very awake to the fact that the situation had parameters he didn't fully understand. Kind of breach, he asked. Don't know. Come on. They went toward the containment section rather than away from it, which was either good instinct or a survivable mistake, and she'd know which when she got there. She found was this. The containment cell was open. Not broken, not torn apart in the way the earlier briefing materials had suggested alien strength could tear things apart, but open the way the pod had opened, that same phase change absence. The entity stood in the center of the corridor outside its cell, and the 4 operatives who had arrived before Voss were arranged in a loose half-circle around it. None of them doing anything, all of them very still. Voss understood when she saw their faces that the stillness was not tactical. It was the stillness of people who were looking at something and feeling it look back. The entity turned when she entered the corridor. It looked at her the way it had looked at her on the mountain. The weapons down, she said to the room, without looking away from it. Nobody moved. I'm not asking. She put enough of her 20 years into the words that 2 of the operatives lowered their weapons without deciding to. She'd learned that voice from a master sergeant in Kandahar, who had once stopped a riot with 3 words, and a particular quality of spine. Down. Give it room. The entity watched her through all of this. It was still wearing the garment that moved like a second skin. It was standing the way someone stands when they are very tired, and have been standing for a long time. With effort, with the subtle lean that means the legs are telling the body something, and the body is overruling it. It was hurt. She hadn't seen it in the mountain cold and the morning chaos, but in the flat white of the corridor lighting she could see it now. something dark along its left side, staining through the garment, and the way it held its left arm slightly away from its body, the way people hold injuries. "You need medical attention," she said. It turned its head at her tone, not understanding the words. Understanding the tone, she took one step to forward it and it didn't move back. She took another. Shh. The operatives watched with the focused attention of people who were considering whether to intervene and were calculating the odds. Moss's voice came through someone's radio, tinny and sharp. "Do not let it." She held up her hand, not to the entity, to the room. She took the third step. They were close now. She could feel the heat coming off it, which surprised her. She'd expected cold, something cryo-preserved, something not warm. But it ran hot, like a fever, like something burning. She reached out with her right hand, slowly palm up. Not a weapon, not a restraint. The oldest human signal she knew: "I am unarmed. I am not yet your enemy." The entity looked at her hand. Then, it looked at her face. Then it placed its own hand in hers. 3 fingers longer than a human hand should be. Skin that felt like warm stone, and made a sound against the back of its teeth that might have been exhaustion, might have been gratitude, might have been both at once. A sound she'd heard before from soldiers at the end of things. Arellano said quietly, "I'll get the med kit." The second alien came through the wall at 0412, not a metaphor. Through the wall. The limestone Moss and conduit and everything Moss's engineers had built to keep the outside. A shape moving at a velocity that turned material into vapor along a narrow channel, and then a figure standing in the dust and debris of its own entrance. And the sight alarms reaching a register that made several operatives clap their hands over their ears. She had seen the briefing photographs. She had set them face down on the table. She looked at Ginzu and understood that the photographs had done what photographs always do with extreme things. Flattened and reduced them into something the brain could process and then forget. What stood in the corridor was not forgettable. It was the size of a large man in the way that a tsunami is the size of a wave. Technically accurate and operationally misleading. Its secondary limbs were not arms. They moved with the articulation of tentacles, but with the purposeful snap of weapons. Its face held something recognizably expressive in the worst possible way. It was pleased. It had found what it came for and it was going to take it. And nothing on this rock was going to matter in the attempt. It looked at the entity, at Chimera. Voss had started thinking of it as Chimera without deciding to, and spoke. The sound it made was the same language performed differently. Where Chimera's voice compressed music into breath, this thing's voice was music that had been stripped and weaponized. Harmonics that hit the ear wrong and sent the animal parts of the brain running for their exits. Chimera's hand tightened around Voss's. Voss did 3 things, very fast, in the order they made sense. She pulled Chimera back and slightly behind her. She brought up her sidearm. She said, to the room, in the voice that ended riots, "Everyone's still standing on me." Now, the operatives moved. She didn't look to see how many. She kept her eyes on Ginzu, on the secondary limbs, on the way it cocked its head at her, the way a large predator cocks its head at something small and interesting. It was not afraid of her. That was fine. She had spent her career in situations where being afraid of her was not a prerequisite for things going her way. "Villano," she said, level here. "The kit bag. Is there anything in the kit bag that would?" "Phosphorus grenade," he said. "Left front pocket." She'd have to think about why her medic was carrying a phosphorus grenade later. When I say, Ginzu moved, it moved the way the breach had moved. At a velocity that made intention and arrival simultaneous. And she was already moving too, dragging Chimera sideways as the secondary sim swept the space where they'd been. And then she was pressed against the corridor wall, with Chimera behind her and Ginzu, between her and the operatives, and she was doing the math on the phosphorus grenade, and the confined corridor, and the limestone ceiling, and the math was not encouraging. This was the thing about Voss. The thing her master sergeant had said about her once in a report she'd never been meant to read. She doesn't revise the situation to match the math. She revises the math. She looked at the conduit on the ceiling. The industrial, electrical conduit running the length of the corridor. She looked at the junction box 12 feet away. She looked at the puddle of coolant that had been spreading from a cracked pipe since the breach. A slow, dark pool. that now extended along the corridor floor between her and Ginzu. She said very quietly to Kimura, "Hold on to me." Then she shut the junction box. The arc hit the coolant at the same moment. Arellano hit the deck, and the operatives hit the deck, and Ginzu, who was fast enough to dodge bullets and strong enough to walk through walls, was standing in the middle of the pool with its secondary limbs extended and no evolutionary experience in its entire species history that had prepared it for what electricity does when it finds a conductive medium under a being that had never needed to develop resistance to it. The noise it made was not in any register she had words for. It went down, not dead. She knew it wasn't dead, but down. "Now," she said to Aureliano, and he put the phosphorus grenade 20 feet down the corridor in the direction they weren't going, and the corridor filled with white light and white smoke, and they were running, Chimera's hand still in hers. The burning behind them, buying them time measured in seconds, which was all she'd ever asked for. The third alien found them in the vehicle bay. He was less terrible than Ginzu. That was the first thing. He stood between the vehicles and the exit door, with the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting and knows they are going to be the one to decide what happens next. And he was looking at Chimera with an expression that was not predatory and not possessive and not. And this was the word she kept coming back to. Human, but was something she recognized anyway. Doing its level best to hold the shape of resolve. Keanu. Briefing materials had a photograph of a figure and the notation, "Consider hostile, eliminate on contact." She had a sidearm with 6 rounds, and Arellano had a ceramic blade, and Chimera had one good arm and was running a fever that would kill a person, and they were standing in a vehicle bay 40 meters from an exit that this thing was blocking. Psst. He looked at her. His voice, when he spoke, was that compressed music sound, lower than Chimera's, darker, but the same nature, and she felt it in the same place behind her sternum. Psst, Chimera answered. A longer sequence of sounds, the tone shifting. She heard urgency in it, something that in any human voice would have been argument or appeal. Keanu's expression didn't change. He looked at Chimera the way you look at something you love enough to end. "No," Voss said. Both of them turned to her. She wasn't sure where the word had come from. She wasn't sure if it had come from a place that had any tactical logic. It had come from the same place that made her step between Chimera and Ginzu's secondary limb. The same place that made her say, "Your team comes with me to Director Moss on a mountain 4 hours ago." The same place that made her answer the entity's question, whatever question it had been, without a word. "No," she said again, "because the second time is where conviction lives. We're not doing this." Keanu tilted his head. She kept the sidearm at her side, not raised, not holstered, present as a statement of capability, not intention. "I heard the briefing. I know what you're trying to prevent. I know what happens if Ginzu gets what he wants." She paused. "I also know what we look like to you. I know what this looks like from where you're standing, and I know that in about 6 minutes Moss is going to get through that sealed door, and then nobody gets a choice about anything." Arellano, behind her, was very still in the way that meant he was listening to something. She wasn't saying out loud and deciding whether he agreed with it. "There is a third option," she said. "There is always a third option. And it is almost never the one that the people with the most firepower are planning for." She put the sidearm on the hood of the nearest vehicle. She held up both hands, the oldest signal, the one that predates language and weapons and the concept of sides. Keanu looked at her hands, at her face, at Chimera, who had come to stand beside her, and not behind her, and who said something that was 2 syllables, and whose tone she had a name for now. It was the tone of someone answering a question they've been sitting with for a long time. Keanu's resolve didn't break. It did something more interesting than break. It shifted. The grief was still there. The love was still there. And there was something new. The thing that happens when a person is shown a door they hadn't thought to look for. He stepped aside. She drove. Arellano navigated. Kimura sat in the rear seat with the medic kit in its lap, and its fingers moving over the field dressings with a focused attention that suggested either extreme intelligence or the particular expertise of someone who had been treated for injuries before and was now treating itself efficiently and without drama. Keanu rode in the cargo area. He did not speak. He watched the desert passing through the rear window. with an expression she'd learned to read by now. A being processing a situation that had moved faster than its predictions. The radio on the dashboard lit up. Moss's frequencies, then military channels, then the broader emergency network with its crisp automated loops. She turned the volume down to where it became furniture. "Where are we going?" Arellano asked. "Away from here first. Then we figure out the rest." That's a plan in the same way that breathing is a plan. Breathing is a plan. It's the first plan. Everything else is the second plan. He almost smiled. She'd worked with him for 2 years, and she had a specific catalog of his almost smiles. From the rear seat, Chimera made a sound. She caught it in the rearview mirror. That luminescent face turned toward the pre-dawn horizon, coming up over the eastern mountains. Something in it that she didn't have a name for, but that she understood the same way she'd understood the tone of the question on the mountain. It was looking at something it had given up on being able to see again. She didn't say anything. She drove. The road was empty, and the sky was going from black to the particular dark blue that means the night is deciding whether to end. Arellano turned the medallion over once in his fingers. She didn't see it, but she knew by the slight shift of his shoulder, and then tucked it back inside his collar. "Your grandmother's going to ask where we've been," she said. "She already knows," he said. "She knew when I left. Smart woman, the smartest. She says the difference between a soldier and a killer is that a soldier can still be surprised by the third option." Voss drove and thought about that and didn't answer, because it was the kind of thing that deserved to sit in the air without a response pressing it flat. They put 70 miles between themselves and Site Kappa before she stopped on a high desert overlook and cut the engine. The sun was coming over the mountains in the east, the specific color of oxidized copper, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look briefly recovered from something. Desert stretched south in long folds, and the only sound was the engine ticking down and the wind. And very faint, something else. Chimera, in the back seat, humming. It wasn't music she recognized. 3 notes in a pattern that didn't resolve the way she expected. Cycling slowly, and the sound moved through the air of the vehicle the way a temperature moves, until Arellano started very quietly humming too. Not the same notes, something underneath. A counterpoint he'd found by feel. She watched them in the rearview mirror. Her medic from Laredo, Texas. And this being from somewhere she had no coordinates for. Making sound together in the gray desert morning. And the sound was not the same, and it didn't clash. Keanu in the cargo area had gone still in a new way. Not the vigilant stillness of a predator, or the waiting stillness of a soldier. The still that happens when something you expected to end does not end. She got out of the vehicle. She walked to the overlook's edge and stood in the copper morning and looked at the country below and thought about the debrief she would never give and the report she would never file and the decision she had made in a vehicle bay with 6 rounds and 2 hands held open. She thought about the question on the mountain. What had been asked of her, in a language she didn't speak, by something that had looked at her specifically out of everyone present, as if she were the one who would know the answer. She thought she understood it now. Not what the words meant, what the question meant, the thing underneath the words, the thing that any person asks, at the end of a long time alone, in the moment before they risk trusting something that has every historical reason to be a threat. Are you going to be what they were? Or are you going to be something else? She'd answered, without knowing she was answering. The yes was in the step toward the pod. The yes was in the voice that stopped the weapons going up. The yes was in the word, no spoken to a being who could have taken her apart for saying it. She heard footsteps behind her. Chimera stood at the edge of the overlook, 3 feet away. The morning. Light doing something complex with the green of its hair and the luminescence of its skin, looking at the desert below. The injury was bandaged now, the fever slightly down. She could tell because the air around it was less hot. It spoke. 4 syllables. Then paused. Then one more. She didn't understand. She said, "I don't understand." It looked at her. And then, with the deliberate care of something that had been listening to her for hours, in a voice that was clearly going through unfamiliar consonants, in the way a person goes through unfamiliar territory, it said, "You chose." She looked yes, she said. It looked back at the desert. She looked at the desert. The sun came over the mountains and made the copper light brighter and the shadows longer, and behind them she could hear Arellano humming, something that had nothing to do with the three-note pattern, and everything to do with it, fruit. And the engine continued its cooling conversation with the air, and somewhere far to the south and the west, Moss was explaining to someone how he had lost the most significant asset in human history to a sergeant who had put her sidearm on the hood of a car and held up her hands. She had no particular feelings about that. She had a vehicle with 3/4 of a tank. She had a medic who could find the third option under fire. She had, in the cargo area, a being that had come to this planet to prevent something monstrous and had not yet decided whether the planet was worth preventing it for. She had, beside her at the edge of the overlook, something that had looked at every other human it had encountered as a category, and had looked at her as a person, and had learned 2 words in a night to say what it wanted to say to her. That was enough. It had always been enough. It was the only thing, in 20 years of being asked impossible things, that had ever actually been enough. "Come on," she said. "We've got a long way to go before anyone starts looking in the right places." Chimera turned from the desert, made a sound that, in any human voice, would have been assent, walked back to the vehicle. Voss followed, and did not look back, and the sun continued to arrive. 2,000 miles away, in a hospital room in Albuquerque, a man who had been drained on a mountainside was telling a doctor about what he'd seen in the trees. And the doctor was writing things down with the careful neutrality of a person who had decided to document first and understand later. The man said there had been something that moved wrong, and a cold that went all the way through, and the dog hadn't made any noise at all, not even at the end. The doctor said, "Does it hurt when you breathe?" The man said, "It hurts when I think about it." I said, "Yes, that kind tends to." He wrote down the vitals and the time and the date, and set the clipboard on the hook at the end of the bed, and left the room, and the man lay in the white hospital light and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the particular silence that comes after every animal within a kilometer has stopped making noise. The silence that precedes the world changing, and how the world had changed and he was still here, which was not nothing, which had never been nothing, which was, if you were paying attention, the most human thing of all, still here, inexplicably, stubbornly, unreasonably still here, ready if necessary to be surprised by the third option.